The autumn rain fell steadily on Portland's tree-lined streets in October 1959, washing away the last traces of what would become one of Oregon's most enduring mysteries. For nearly 3 decades, a single question haunted the close-knit parish community of St. Augustine. Who killed 25-year-old Helen Margaret O'Connor, and why did they wait so long to strike? Helen's story began like so many others in post-war America. Born to Irish immigrants in 1934, she embodied the optimism of a generation rebuilding itself. Her father worked the docks along the Willamette River, while her mother tended to their modest home on Southeast Division Street. Helen was the middle child of 5. Known throughout the neighborhood for her infectious laugh and her habit of humming hymns while hanging laundry in the backyard. By 1959, Portland was experiencing unprecedented growth. The city's population had swelled to nearly 375,000 residents, drawn by opportunities in the timber industry and the promise of the Pacific Northwest's natural beauty. New subdivisions sprouted across the east side, while downtown bustled with department stores and movie theaters. It was a time when neighbors knew each other's names, when children played freely in the streets until dinner time, and when the most serious crime in many neighborhoods was the occasional bicycle theft. Helen worked as a secretary at Morrison & Associates, a small accounting firm downtown. According to her colleagues, she was punctual, reliable, and well-liked. She had dreams of saving enough money to attend Portland State College, hoping to become a teacher. Her supervisor later told investigators that Helen often stayed late to help with filing, never complaining about the extra work. She was, by all accounts, building the foundation for a promising future. The young woman lived in a boarding house on Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard, a respectable establishment run by Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, a widow who rented rooms to working women. The house rules were strict but fair. No male visitors after 8 o'clock, rent due on the 1st of each month, and everyone was expected to attend Sunday dinner together. Helen thrived in this structured environment, forming close friendships with her fellow boarders. On weekends, Helen could often be found at St. Augustine Catholic Church, where she volunteered with the youth choir and helped organize parish social events. Father Benedict Walsh, the church's longtime pastor, would later describe her as a devoted parishioner who never missed Sunday Mass. Her faith was central to her identity, providing both comfort and community in a city where she was still establishing her roots. The neighborhood surrounding St. Augustine was a tapestry of working-class families, recent immigrants, and young professionals like Helen. Southeast Portland in 1959 retained much of its small-town character despite the city's rapid expansion. Corner groceries knew their customers by name, and the local pharmacy still delivered prescriptions by bicycle. It was the kind of place where unusual occurrences were quickly noticed and discussed over backyard fences. Helen's routine was predictable and safe. She walked the same route to work each morning, stopping at Murphy's Corner store for coffee and a newspaper. Evenings were spent reading in the boarding house parlor or attending church activities. Saturday afternoons often found her at the Hawthorne Library, where she volunteered to read to children. Her life was quiet, purposeful, and seemingly without conflict. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, something sinister was taking shape. According to police records from the era, there had been a series of minor incidents in the neighborhood throughout the summer and early fall of 1959. Reports of a prowler, strange phone calls to several boarding houses, and at least 2 attempted break-ins had residents on edge. The Portland Police Bureau, however, was stretched thin and treated these incidents as isolated pranks rather than a pattern of escalating behavior. The last person to see Helen alive was Mrs. Kellerman, who noted that the young woman seemed unusually quiet during Sunday dinner on October 11th. Helen had mentioned feeling watched during her walk home from church, but she dismissed it as nerves. She retired to her room early that evening, telling her landlady she planned to write letters to her family back east. What happened in the hours that followed would shatter the community's sense of security and launch an investigation that would span generations, touching the lives of countless families and forever changing how Portland approached unsolved crimes. Monday morning, October 12, 1959, began like any other at the Hawthorne Boulevard boarding house. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman prepared breakfast for her tenants, expecting the familiar sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs as the working women began their daily routines. When Helen O'Connor failed to appear for her usual 7 o'clock coffee, the landlady initially assumed the young secretary was feeling unwell. By 8:30, concern replaced assumption. Helen had never missed work without notice, and her employer at the downtown accounting firm had already called twice asking about her whereabouts. Mrs. Kellerman climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, her worry mounting with each step. She knocked gently on Helen's door, calling her name softly so as not to disturb the other tenants who worked evening shifts. The silence that greeted her was absolute and unsettling. What Mrs. Kellerman discovered when she used her master key would forever alter the peaceful boarding house and the surrounding community. According to police reports filed that morning, Helen O'Connor had been the victim of a violent attack in her own room. The scene suggested a struggle had occurred, though investigators would later note that the violence appeared to have been contained to a relatively small area near the window. The Portland Police Bureau responded within minutes of Mrs. Kellerman's frantic telephone call. Detective Raymond Kowalski, a 15-year veteran of the force, arrived to find a crime scene that would challenge every assumption about safety in their quiet neighborhood. The victim had been discovered in her nightgown, suggesting the attack occurred during the late evening or early morning hours. There were no obvious signs of forced entry through the front door, leading investigators to focus their attention on the room's single window, which faced the alley behind the building. News of the crime spread through the Parish community with devastating speed. By noon, clusters of neighbors gathered on street corners, speaking in hushed tones about the unthinkable tragedy that had befallen one of their own. The afternoon edition of the Oregonian carried a brief report describing the incident as an apparent burglary gone wrong, though police had not yet confirmed whether anything had been stolen from Helen's modest possessions. Father Benedict Walsh arrived at the boarding house shortly after receiving word from one of his parishioners. The elderly priest, who had served St. Augustine for over 20 years, was visibly shaken as he spoke with investigators. According to witness statements, he described Helen as a model parishioner who had no known enemies and lived a life of quiet devotion. The priest's presence brought some comfort to Mrs. Kellerman and the other boarders, who were struggling to comprehend how such violence could penetrate their sanctuary. The initial investigation revealed several puzzling elements that would plague detectives for decades to come. Helen's purse remained untouched on her dresser, containing her weekly wages and a small amount of savings she kept for emergencies. Her jewelry, including a modest gold cross necklace that had been a confirmation gift, was found undisturbed. If robbery had been the motive, the perpetrator had left empty-handed. More troubling was the discovery of muddy footprints on the fire escape outside Helen's window. The prints suggested someone had climbed up from the alley, though the metal structure was old and prone to creaking. None of the other tenants reported hearing unusual sounds during the night, raising questions about how an intruder could have accessed the second floor without detection. Detective Kowalski and his team spent the entire day processing the scene, photographing evidence and interviewing every resident of the boarding house. The other tenants, all working women in their 20s and 30s, were cooperative, but could provide little useful information. Most had retired early on Sunday evening, and the thick walls of the old building had muffled any sounds that might have indicated trouble. The neighborhood canvass yielded equally frustrating results. While several residents recalled the recent reports of a prowler in the area, no one could provide a detailed description of any suspicious individuals. The corner grocer remembered seeing Helen on Saturday afternoon, purchasing her usual items and appearing in good spirits. The pharmacist noted that she had picked up a prescription for her landlady on Friday, engaging in pleasant conversation about the upcoming Parish Harvest Festival. As evening fell on October 12th, the boarding house stood eerily quiet. Mrs. Kellerman had contacted the families of her other tenants, and several young women had chosen to stay elsewhere until the investigation progressed. The normally bustling household felt hollow and vulnerable, its sense of security shattered by the morning's terrible discovery. The Portland Police Bureau established a dedicated telephone line for tips related to the case, and Detective Kowalski announced that additional patrols would be assigned to the Southeast Division area. However, the initial 24 hours had produced more questions than answers, setting the stage for what would become one of Oregon's most enduring mysteries. The Portland Police Bureau's investigation into Helen O'Connor's death began with methodical precision, but the limitations of 1959 forensic science would soon become apparent. Detective Raymond Kowalski assembled a team of 6 investigators, the largest task force the department had assigned to a single case in recent memory. Their first priority was establishing a timeline and identifying potential suspects within Helen's social circle. The investigation initially focused on 3 primary theories. The first suggested a random break-in that had escalated beyond the perpetrator's original intentions. The second explored the possibility of someone within Helen's immediate circle who had access to her routine and living situation. The third theory, which gained traction after interviews with parish members, centered on the recent reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. Forensic analysis of the crime scene yielded mixed results. The muddy footprints on the fire escape were photographed and measured, revealing a men's work boot, size 10, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. However, the rain that had fallen throughout the previous week had compromised much of the evidence in the alley below. Fingerprint analysis of Helen's room produced dozens of prints, most belonging to the victim, her landlady, and the other boarding house residents who had occasionally visited her room for social gatherings. The most promising lead emerged from fabric fibers found caught on the window latch. Laboratory analysis determined they came from a dark wool coat, likely navy blue or black, of a type commonly worn by working men in the area. This discovery led investigators to focus their attention on the nearby industrial district, where hundreds of dock workers, mill employees, and construction crews matched this general description. Detective Kowalski's team conducted extensive interviews with Helen's co-workers at the accounting firm. Her supervisor, Mr. Harold Brennan, provided a detailed account of Helen's final days at work. According to office records, she had seemed distracted on Friday, October 9th, mentioning to a colleague that she felt someone had been following her during her lunch break. However, when pressed for details, Helen had been unable to provide a specific description of her suspected stalker. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Kellerman revealed that Helen had received several anonymous telephone calls in the weeks leading up to her death. The calls typically came in the evening, and when Helen answered, the caller would remain silent for several seconds before hanging up. The landlady had initially dismissed these incidents as wrong numbers, but the frequency had increased to nearly every other night by early October. Police traced the calls through the telephone company's limited records, but the technology of the era made it impossible to determine their origin with precision. The calls appeared to come from various public telephones throughout southeast Portland, suggesting either multiple callers or someone deliberately attempting to avoid detection. A significant breakthrough seemed to occur when investigators identified a potential suspect among the dock workers. Frank Kowalski, no relation to the detective, had been fired from his job at the Port of Portland 3 weeks before Helen's death. Co-workers described him as increasingly erratic and prone to making inappropriate comments about women in the neighborhood. Frank had been seen in the vicinity of the boarding house on multiple occasions, allegedly asking questions about the female tenants. The investigation into Frank Kowalski consumed valuable resources for nearly 2 months. Police surveillance revealed that he frequented several taverns near the waterfront and had a history of minor altercations with law enforcement. However, when detectives finally arrested him for questioning in December 1959, his alibi for the night of October 11th proved ironclad. Frank had been in the Multnomah County Jail, serving a 3-day sentence for public intoxication at the time of Helen's death. This setback forced investigators to reconsider their approach. The parish community, meanwhile, had grown increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. Father Walsh organized prayer vigils for Helen's family and increased security around church events. But the sense of vulnerability persisted. Several young women had moved away from the neighborhood entirely, and the boarding house struggled to maintain occupancy. Another promising lead emerged when a witness came forward claiming to have seen a man climbing down the fire escape behind the boarding house on the morning of October 12th. The witness, an elderly man who lived across the alley, had initially assumed he was observing a maintenance worker. However, when he learned of Helen's death later that day, he realized the timing was suspicious. Unfortunately, the witness's description was vague, mentioning only that the individual wore dark clothing and appeared to be of average height and build. The investigation expanded to include background checks on all male employees at businesses within a 6-block radius of the boarding house. This massive undertaking strained the department's resources and produced hundreds of potential suspects, none of whom could be definitively linked to the crime. By spring 1960, the initial momentum had stalled, and Detective Kowalski faced mounting pressure to solve the case that had captivated Portland's attention. By the summer of 1961, the Helen O'Connor investigation had gradually shifted from active pursuit to periodic review. Detective Raymond Kowalski, who had dedicated nearly 2 years to the case, was reassigned to the robbery division as new crimes demanded the Portland Police Bureau's immediate attention. The thick file containing witness statements, evidence reports, and investigative notes was transferred to a metal cabinet in the basement of the precinct building, joining dozens of other unsolved cases from the decade. The transition from active investigation to cold case status occurred without fanfare or official announcement. Resources that had once been dedicated to following leads and conducting interviews were redirected to more recent crimes with fresher evidence and viable suspects. The telephone tip line, which had generated hundreds of calls in the first months after Helen's death, was quietly disconnected. The case that had once commanded front-page coverage in the Oregonian was relegated to occasional anniversary articles that grew shorter and less detailed with each passing year. For the O'Connor family, the gradual abandonment of the investigation represented a devastating blow to their hopes for justice. Helen's parents, who had traveled from their home in Massachusetts to assist with the initial investigation, returned east with more questions than answers. Her father, a proud man who had worked the Boston docks for 30 years, struggled to understand how his daughter's killer could simply vanish without consequence. The family maintained correspondence with Portland police for several years, writing letters that inquired about new developments and pleaded for continued attention to Helen's case. The parish community of St. Augustine experienced its own form of prolonged grief as the investigation stalled. Father Benedict Walsh continued to hold annual memorial services for Helen, but attendance dwindled as parishioners moved away or found it too painful to revisit the tragedy. The boarding house on Hawthorne Boulevard never fully recovered its sense of security or community, Mrs. Kellerman eventually sold the property in 1963, unable to maintain occupancy levels as potential tenants sought housing in neighborhoods untouched by violent crime. Several attempts were made to revive the investigation during the 1960s and early 1970s. In 1965, a new detective named William Crawford reviewed the case file as part of a department initiative to examine unsolved homicides using updated investigative techniques. Crawford identified several leads that had been inadequately pursued, including a more thorough examination of the fabric fibers found at the crime scene. However, budget constraints and competing priorities prevented a comprehensive reinvestigation. The case received renewed attention in 1968 when a similar crime occurred in nearby Beaverton. A young woman was attacked in her apartment, and initial similarities to Helen's case prompted investigators to explore potential connections. The Beaverton case was solved within weeks when the perpetrator was caught attempting another break-in, but the resolution only highlighted how Helen's killer had managed to escape detection for nearly a decade. Technological advances in forensic science during the 1970s offered new hope for solving cold cases, but Helen's evidence had been stored under conditions that compromised its integrity. The fabric fibers had deteriorated, and the fingerprint cards had been damaged by moisture in the basement storage facility. When Detective Crawford attempted to re-examine the physical evidence in 1974, much of it was found to be unusable for modern analysis techniques. The case file was transferred multiple times as the Portland Police Bureau reorganized its cold case procedures. Each transfer resulted in the loss of some documentation, and by 1980, the investigation consisted primarily of the original crime scene photographs and a handful of witness statements. The comprehensive timeline that Detective Kowalski had meticulously constructed was lost during a filing system conversion in 1977. Helen's story became part of Portland's urban folklore, occasionally referenced in newspaper articles about unsolved crimes or neighborhood safety. True crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators periodically contacted the police department requesting access to case information, but the degraded state of the files made meaningful review nearly impossible. The boarding house where Helen had lived was demolished in 1979 to make way for a small shopping center. No memorial marker was installed, and within a few years, most residents of the area were unaware of the tragedy that had occurred on the site. The physical spaces that had defined Helen's life in Portland were gradually erased by urban development and the passage of time. By the mid-1980s, Helen O'Connor's case existed primarily in the memories of a few retired police officers and aging parishioners who had known her personally. The investigation that had once consumed significant resources and public attention had become a footnote in Portland's criminal history, seemingly destined to remain forever unsolved. The resurrection of Helen O'Connor's case began not with new evidence, but with a determined cold case detective who refused to accept that some mysteries were destined to remain unsolved. In January 1987, Detective Maria Santos joined the Portland Police Bureau's newly formed Cold Case Unit, a specialized division created to leverage advancing forensic technologies on decades-old investigations. Detective Santos had built her reputation on meticulous attention to detail and an unwavering belief that every victim deserved justice, regardless of how much time had passed. When she first encountered Helen's file in the basement archives, she was struck by the thoroughness of the original investigation and frustrated by how close Detective Kowalski had come to identifying viable suspects before the case went cold. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the evidence inventory, Santos discovered that a small piece of fabric from Helen's nightgown had been preserved separately from the deteriorated fibers found at the window. This sample, stored in a sealed envelope and forgotten during previous reviews, contained what appeared to be biological material that had never been subjected to modern analysis. The Oregon State Crime Laboratory had recently acquired DNA testing capabilities, technology that was revolutionizing criminal investigations across the country. In March 1987, Santos submitted the fabric sample for analysis, hoping that 3 decades of storage had not completely degraded any genetic material that might be present. The results exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Laboratory technicians successfully extracted a partial DNA profile from the sample, indicating the presence of genetic material from someone other than Helen O'Connor. The profile was incomplete, containing only enough markers to exclude suspects rather than definitively identify a perpetrator, but it represented the first concrete scientific evidence the case had produced since 1959. Armed with this DNA profile, Santos began the painstaking process of comparing it against known suspects from the original investigation. The Portland Police Bureau had maintained biological samples from several individuals who had been questioned during the initial inquiry, including hair samples and saliva specimens collected during routine processing. Most of these samples had been discarded over the years, but a few remained in storage. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Santos discovered that the DNA profile matched genetic material collected from a suspect who had never been seriously considered during the original investigation. According to archived records, Robert Eugene Fletcher had been briefly questioned in November 1959 as part of the neighborhood canvass, but he had been quickly dismissed as a person of interest. Fletcher had worked as a maintenance supervisor at a textile mill approximately 8 blocks from Helen's boarding house. In 1959, he was 27 years old, married, and considered a respectable member of the community. His brief interaction with investigators had occurred only because he lived within the expanded search radius that police had established around the crime scene. Further investigation revealed troubling details about Fletcher's background that had been overlooked during the original inquiry. Employment records showed that he had been terminated from 2 previous jobs for inappropriate behavior toward female employees, though these incidents had been handled internally and never reported to law enforcement. More significantly, Fletcher had called in sick to work on October 12, 1959, claiming to have injured his hand in a household accident. The DNA evidence prompted Santos to seek a court order to exhume Fletcher's body from Riverview Cemetery, where he had been buried following his death from a heart attack in 1983. The exhumation, conducted in September 1987, allowed forensic specialists to collect additional genetic material for comparison with the evidence from Helen's case. Advanced DNA testing confirmed the match with a degree of scientific certainty that would have been impossible in 1959. According to laboratory reports, the probability that the genetic material belonged to someone other than Robert Fletcher was less than 1 in several million. The revelation that Helen O'Connor's killer had been living in the same community for decades, maintaining a facade of normalcy while her case remained unsolved, sent shockwaves through the Portland Police Bureau. Fletcher had continued working in the area, eventually becoming a supervisor at a different manufacturing facility. He had raised 3 children and been active in his own parish, presenting himself as a model citizen while carrying the secret of his crime. Detective Santos worked closely with the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office to prepare a comprehensive case file documenting the DNA evidence and the investigative process that had led to Fletcher's identification. Although the suspect's death precluded criminal prosecution, the scientific evidence provided definitive closure to a case that had haunted the community for nearly 3 decades. The Portland Police Bureau's announcement in October 1987 that Helen O'Connor's murder had been solved through DNA evidence sent ripples of shock and disbelief throughout the community that had lived with the mystery for 28 years. The revelation that Robert Eugene Fletcher, a man who had successfully concealed his crime while maintaining a respectable public persona, was responsible for Helen's death, challenged everything the neighborhood thought it knew about safety and trust. Detective Maria Santos held a press conference on October 11th, exactly 28 years after Helen's death, to formally announce the case's resolution. The timing was deliberate, intended to honor Helen's memory and provide closure to those who had never forgotten her. Santos carefully explained the scientific process that had led to Fletcher's identification, emphasizing the reliability of DNA evidence while acknowledging the frustration of being unable to pursue criminal charges against a deceased suspect. The O'Connor family, now scattered across the country, received notification of the breakthrough before the public announcement. Helen's younger brother Kevin, who had become a teacher in Boston, expressed a mixture of relief and anger upon learning the killer's identity. The family had spent decades wondering if Helen's murderer was still alive, possibly living freely while their sister lay in her grave. The confirmation that Fletcher had died 4 years earlier brought a complicated form of closure that combined justice with the bitter reality that he had never faced consequences for his actions. Father Benedict Walsh, now retired but still living in Portland, was among the first community members contacted by police. The elderly priest, who had conducted Helen's funeral service and maintained her memory through annual memorial masses, struggled to reconcile the Fletcher he had known as a fellow parishioner with the man who had committed such a heinous crime. Fletcher had attended St. Mark's Catholic Church, located just 6 blocks from St. Augustine, and had been considered a devoted family man by those who knew him. The investigation into Fletcher's background revealed a carefully constructed facade that had fooled employers, neighbors, and even his own family for decades. Employment records showed that he had worked steadily throughout his adult life, progressing from entry-level positions to supervisory roles in various manufacturing facilities. His personnel files contain no indication of the violent tendencies that had manifested on that October night in 1959. Fletcher's widow, Dorothy, who had remarried in 1985, was devastated by the revelation about her late husband's secret. She had known Robert for over 30 years, bearing his 3 children and sharing what she believed was a normal, if sometimes troubled, marriage. The DNA evidence forced her to reconsider decades of memories, searching for signs she might have missed that could have indicated her husband's capacity for violence. The Fletcher children, now adults with families of their own, faced the traumatic realization that their father had been a murderer. The eldest son, Robert Jr., worked as an accountant in nearby Beaverton and had named his own son after his father. The family struggled with questions about genetic predisposition to violence and worried about how the revelation would affect their children's understanding of their grandfather's legacy. Community members who had known Fletcher expressed disbelief and horror at the news. Co-workers described him as quiet but reliable, someone who kept to himself but never displayed aggressive behavior. Neighbors recalled him as a man who maintained his property well and rarely caused problems, though some noted that he seemed uncomfortable around women and often avoided social gatherings. The resolution of Helen's case prompted the Portland Police Bureau to review other unsolved crimes from the same era, searching for potential connections to Fletcher. Detective Santos coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions to determine if the newly identified killer might have been responsible for additional attacks. However, no definitive links were established to other crimes, suggesting that Helen's murder may have been an isolated incident of violence. The case's resolution also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence from unsolved crimes, even when initial investigative efforts proved unsuccessful. The fabric sample that ultimately identified Fletcher had been overlooked for decades, demonstrating how advancing technology could breathe new life into cold cases that seemed hopeless. St. Augustine Catholic Church held a special memorial service for Helen in November 1987, attended by many parishioners who remembered her and others who had followed her story through the years. The service provided a sense of closure for a community that had carried the weight of an unsolved murder for nearly 3 decades. The resolution of Helen O'Connor's murder case marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of criminal investigation techniques, demonstrating how scientific advances could breathe new life into cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable. The Portland Police Bureau's success with DNA evidence in the Fletcher case became a model for law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest, inspiring the creation of dedicated cold case units and standardized evidence preservation protocols. Detective Maria Santos received national recognition for her work on the O'Connor case, speaking at conferences and training seminars about the importance of maintaining hope in long-dormant investigations. Her methodical approach to reviewing archived evidence became a template for other cold case investigators, emphasizing the critical need to preserve biological materials even when their immediate value was unclear. The case study was incorporated into police academy curricula, teaching new generations of investigators that technological advancement could transform seemingly worthless evidence into powerful tools for justice. The Oregon State Crime Laboratory expanded its DNA testing capabilities in direct response to the success of the O'Connor investigation. Funding was allocated to process backlogged evidence from dozens of unsolved cases, leading to the resolution of several additional murders and sexual assaults from the 1960s and 1970s. The laboratory's work on cold cases became a national model, attracting federal grants and research partnerships with universities studying forensic genetics. Helen O'Connor's memory was formally honored in 1988 when the Portland Police Bureau established the Helen O'Connor Cold Case Initiative, a program dedicated to applying new technologies to unsolved homicides. The initiative received funding from both city resources and private donations, including a substantial contribution from the O'Connor Family Trust. The program's success rate exceeded expectations, solving nearly 40% of the cases it reviewed during its first 5 years of operation. The case's resolution also prompted changes in how the Catholic Church addressed issues of community safety and support for crime victims' families. Father Walsh worked with diocesan officials to develop protocols for providing long-term pastoral care to families affected by unsolved crimes. The program, implemented across Oregon parishes, recognized that the spiritual and emotional needs of victims' families often extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of a tragedy. Robert Fletcher's identification as Helen's killer forced a broader examination of how communities assess trust and safety. The revelation that a respected community member could harbor such dark secrets challenged assumptions about the ability to judge character based on public behavior. Neighborhood watch programs expanded throughout Southeast Portland, emphasizing the importance of reporting suspicious activity and maintaining awareness of potential threats. The Fletcher family's ordeal highlighted the complex aftermath that occurs when a family member is posthumously identified as a criminal. Support groups were established to help relatives of identified perpetrators cope with guilt, shame, and confusion about their loved ones' hidden actions. Mental health professionals noted that these secondary victims often experienced trauma comparable to that of crime victims' families, requiring specialized counseling and community support. Helen's story became part of Portland's historical record, preserved in police archives and local history collections. The Multnomah County Library created a digital archive documenting the case's progression from initial investigation through final resolution, serving as a resource for researchers studying the evolution of criminal investigation techniques. The archive included crime scene photographs, witness statements, and scientific reports that illustrated how forensic science had advanced over 3 decades. The boarding house site where Helen had lived was eventually redeveloped into a small memorial park, dedicated in 1990 through efforts by former parishioners of St. Augustine. A modest bronze plaque commemorated Helen's life and acknowledged the persistence of those who refused to let her case be forgotten. The memorial served as a reminder that behind every cold case statistic was a real person whose life had been cut short by violence. The O'Connor case ultimately demonstrated that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through the combination of dedicated investigators, advancing technology, and communities that refused to forget their victims. Helen's murder, which had once seemed destined to remain an eternal mystery, became instead a testament to the power of persistence and the evolving capabilities of forensic science to reveal truth even across the passage of decades.